Okay, welcome everybody to this EU Centre webinar on who's going to win in Asia after COVID-19. We are very pleased today to have two distinguished experts. First, Kishore Mahbubani, who's a very distinguished writer, academic, diplomat, just published a book, which I think you can see behind him, Can China Win? He will be speaking first and explaining his views on how he sees Asia developing at the end of this pandemic. Then we'll have comment from Kiki Fukushima in Tokyo, Senior Research Fellow at the Tokyo Foundation, also a former academic and also a member of Prime Minister Abe's National Security Council Advisory Committee. We then open it up to you. Some of you have already sent in questions and I'll put these out. You can also add questions either using the chat box or raising your hand. And we want to make it as interactive as possible. So if you could put your questions quite briefly, and we'll get responses from both of our speakers. So that's the format. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion because I think certainly in Europe, we all agree that it's very unfortunate that this pandemic has sparked a geopolitical controversy, particularly between the US and China. But we are interested in how Asia is going to develop. And Kishore, I give the floor to you for your comments now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fraser, for inviting me to join you. And I'm glad that I'm on the same panel with Kiki. Pleasure to meet you across this thing. Let me make a few points to get the discussion going. I think the first point I have to emphasize is that we are not out of the woods yet. The battle against COVID-19 is not over. We are, as I would say, we are still in the thick of the battle against it, and therefore we are surrounded by the fog of war. And I think it'd be very unwise at this stage to make any kind of definitive predictions about what kind of world is going to emerge, because we know that the world will have to make many significant adjustments. But right now, I suspect most countries are focused on recovery and maybe thinking a bit about what you do subsequently, but recovery is the first imperative now. But the second point I make is that having said that, it's at the same time, it's sort of very puzzling that when you have a major pandemic like this, which is challenging societies around the world, the natural expectation would have been that it would have been the Western societies, the developed societies, would have coped better with this crisis, and Asian societies, like maybe the rest of the third world, would have struggled to handle such a pandemic. But it's very puzzling that that overall, I mean, one can sort of the evidence is more or less clear that especially the East Asian societies have done relatively well in managing this crisis. And I think one figure that is actually quite both stunning and startling is if you look at the fatalities in the population. And, you know, this is about 2 weeks ago in Belgium, I think it's around 50 per 100,000, Spain 43 per 100,000. Italy 40 per 100,000, and you know, UK, USA also quite high. But what's interesting is that the numbers for East Asia are like Korea is South Korea 0.5, Japan 0.5, Australia 0.3, China 0.3, Singapore 0.2. So there's a huge gap, and it's a very puzzling gap. I don't think anyone, because everybody is so focused on fighting COVID-19, no one wants to sort of figure out what's really happening yet. But what I've suggested in an article that I published on economist.com is that it reflects the kind of major investments that the East Asian countries have been making over the years to improve their governments, improve their institutions. And here I always emphasize that the reason why East Asian societies have done relatively well is that they have learned a lot of valuable lessons from the West. You know, I mean, for example, even now as we are fighting COVID-19, the tools that we are using to fight COVID-19 are the tools of Western medicine. let me just say, as an aside, it's not traditional Chinese medicine that is being used to fight COVID-19. It's Western medicine that everybody's using, including China, to deal with COVID-19. So we're having sort of, in a sense, got all these wonderful gifts from the West and developed them and developed the institutional abilities to handle crises like this. Is very puzzling to many East Asians. Why? Why couldn't the Europeans or even the United States, which is the most advanced developed society, do the same? And in fact, initially, what was stunning is the denial that such a problem could even hit UK, US, and the denial carried on for quite a while. And it's actually, as you know, now it's very sad to see the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo blame China and say China was hiding everything, and it was not true. You know, all you have to do is read articles in Nature magazine, you read articles, Lancet magazine. I actually watched an interview with the editor of Lancet, Richard Horton, who documented in great detail all the information that China had been giving out very early and sharing the genomic sequence by as early as 11, 12 January, announcing a public emergency. And of course, when China decided to shut down an entire province 2 days before Chinese New Year, that's amazing. That's a shocking signal that anybody should have picked up. You don't require very sophisticated national intelligence listening equipment to realize something had gone fundamentally wrong in China. That was a loud enough signal. It's like closing down the United States 2 days before Thanksgiving. It's inconceivable, but that's what China did. And that was a loud bang that everyone should have heard around the world. That was 23rd January, but as you know, the US didn't react till the end of March almost, you know, in terms of taking it seriously. So that is clearly something that we need to reflect on. And one point I'd like to make is that part of the reason I suspect why some of the institutions, let's say in the United States, are struggling is that ever since the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, where Ronald Reagan very famously said, you know, government is not the solution, government is the problem. So the assumption was that you got to sort of progressively dismantle government, get rid of big government, make it smaller and smaller and smaller, and then let the markets do everything, and then your society will get stronger and stronger and stronger. This was a case of, I would say, ideology triumphing over common sense in some ways. And so as a result, you notice that even many of the respected federal institutions of the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration had difficulty handling the Boeing 737 crisis. The FDA today is struggling with COVID-19. President Trump wanted to cut funding to the Center for Disease Prevention and Control after COVID-19 had been broken out. So I mean, that shocked the rest of the world. And by contrast, you can see that the investments, most countries in this region have invested in government and government institutions. And just, by the way, just this morning, about 6 or 7 hours ago, I participated in a panel to launch the Spring 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer. Now, it's a complicated report, but the results are quite stunning. Trust in government in Asia, by the way, including China and India, and in fact, the country with the highest level of trust in government is China. And then by contrast, trust in government in Europe is lower. And that, of course, that also partially, and this is what I said at the Edelman discussion, I said, this partially reflects the fact in Asian societies, there's a traditional natural deference to government. Greater faith and trust in government, which is not so much in the West, because in the West there's traditionally more skepticism of the government. But despite all that, the trend is clear. The trust in government is higher in Asia, and by the way, including you know, whether it's China, South Korea, Singapore, it's widespread. So all this then brings me to the next point, which is that I would say that right now, the primary focus of the governments is still on the recovery and on moving on. But at a time when they feel that the Asian countries feel that the world should be coming together, all of us united to deal with this, I would say our number one worry is this tremendous deterioration in the US-China relationship. And in theory, COVID-19 should have brought US and China together to deal with to deal with a common enemy, which is COVID-19. Sadly, actually, relations have become worse to everybody's surprise. And if this carries on, and certainly it looks as though for the next 6 months, it's very clear that in a US presidential election, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden will try to outdo each other in saying, I'm more anti-China than you are. That's something that's very clear. In fact, as I also document in my book, there are deeper structural forces that are driving this anti-China trend in the United States. So for those of us in Asia, and I suspect I would also argue that in some ways here, Asia and Europe actually share common worry, because Asia will suffer from a major deterioration in US-China relations. I think Europe will also suffer from a major deterioration in US-China relations. So actually this is where, if I have one final point to make, I would say that this is actually the time for Europe and East Asia to cooperate even more to see what our common interests are in this new world. And certainly, for example, to give a concrete example, I think both Europe and Asia would agree that the world would be better off with stronger multilateral institutions. So if, for example, in response to COVID-19, the logical thing we should be to support World Health Organization, give it more money as China has done, give it more resources, you provided psychological, political support. So this is precisely the wrong moment for the United States administration to launch a war against the World Health Organization. As you know, there are very few voices that can try to, in some ways, influence the United States. Certainly, Europe has the strongest capabilities to do so. And I guess we in Asia will be very happy if Europe could try to play a helpful, constructive role to try and see how all of us in the world can work together to strengthen multilateral institutions and to work together to deal with COVID-19. So thank you.
Thank you, Kishore. I mean, one of your fellow EU fellows in Singapore, Jan Willem Blanket, Bill, he actually wrote a piece picking up some of the points you made in terms of the East Asia response, and also looking at, the real importance we both have, Europe and Asia, in strengthening the multilateral system. But this is probably something you too would agree with, Kiki. So over to you now for your comments.
Thank you, Fraser, and thank you, Kishore, for your remarks. I was very touched when you have referred to multilateralism, because I have been researching on multilateralism for many years, and in recent years, I have been classified as an endangered species of liberal internationalist. So it is quite rare to hear a positive tone on multilateralism. So I really thank you. Well, I'm sitting in Tokyo, where our mobility restriction has just been extended to the end of this month in order to control further spread of the COVID-19 here in Japan. We have been following the instruction, but the decline has not been enough. Japan's confirmed COVID-19 cases are 15,382 cases, as I have just checked, with death cases of 579. Lacking an effective vaccine and a proven pharmaceutical treatment, I'm afraid we have to change our way of life with or without official mobility control. I'm just hoping that we will be able to have some effective vaccines and proven treatment sooner. The challenge we face today, at least sitting in Tokyo, is how to balance the corona control and resumption of our economic activities. And as you have said at the outset, we are still fighting the battle. So predictions are not something in order. However, taking this opportunity, allow me to ask a couple of questions. You have written extensively on how the COVID-19 may change the world. But do you think Corona will end the globalization? In your article, you mentioned that there is a continuity in our international politics, but more rapid pace in changes, including a move away from US-centric globalization to a more China-centric globalization. And I wonder what you mean by China-centered globalization. If I can learn from you, that would be very helpful. Also on globalization, people have blamed globalization for this particular spread of pandemic, as well as blamed globalization for expected difficulty in picking up our economy after, I don't know whether I should use the term after, but after we come to a point where we can certainly control the pandemic. Is this the end of the globalization? Or put it another way, are there any positive side that I can find in the globalization? In other words, can globalization help us in recovering from this impact, in particular economic impact? Another point, if I may ask, is an impact of the COVID-19 to security situations. Some reports said that China has introduced new administrative district in South China Sea. I don't know whether it is seizing this opportunity or not, but that was a report. North DPRK has launched missiles in March 7 times, and nobody knows the situations in DPRK in a precise manner, at least I don't. And I wonder whether the COVID-19 will create certain security vacuum that can be taken advantage of by some others in the region. I don't see that way, but would like to have your observations on this point. And as everybody says, the virus doesn't have passports, so it's transnational concern. And yet, as you pointed out, we are not working hard to preserve and take advantage of international institutions like WHO. And I wholeheartedly endorse, if I may, your idea of supporting WHO, Europe and Asia together. Are there anything else that we can do together in fighting against COVID-19 and its consequences? I'm talking about EU and Asia. In one of your articles, you have used the analogy of a small room with one benign elephant. But a room, I think, is filled by other animals as well. And are there any roles that we can expect for other animals to play? I shouldn't go any further. I shouldn't get too far. So let me stop here, and I would like to thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Kiki. Well, these are a couple of good questions. I'll try and group two or three at the beginning here, essentially based on what you've been saying, Kishore. One coming in from Jim Moran, the former Director for Asia and the European Commission, and another couple of questions relating to China and whether the initial reaction from China, the warning that you mentioned, was actually sufficient given what we now think is the scale of this pandemic. Are you so satisfied that China could and should have done everything it needed to do at the beginning, shall we say?
Oh, great. Thank you very much. First of all, Kiki, I don't think that we multilateralists are an endangered species. I'm sure you know that I wrote a book 7 years ago in 2013 called The Great Convergence. And actually, the Japanese edition came out, and Madame Sadako Ogata, a great woman, launched the book in Tokyo when I went there. So I actually think that, to put it, because there will be lots of pessimistic darts being thrown into this conversation. So let me throw some optimism into our discussion. And I want to emphasize very, very strongly that I still believe as strongly now as I did 20, even 30 years ago when I first became ambassador to the UN, that multilateralism is a sunrise industry. It is not a sunset industry. And it's a sunrise industry because the world has changed fundamentally. And the image that I use in The Great Convergence to describe how the world has changed fundamentally, I say in the past, when 7.5 billion people lived in 193 separate countries. It was as though they were living in 193 separate boats. Now the world has shrunk, and now the 7.5 billion people no longer live in 193 separate boats. The 7.5 billion people live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And we've discovered we are on the same boat because, you know, just like the virus infected Diamond Princess of Japan, planet Earth has become a virus-infected boat. That's very clear. So we all, if we clean our cabins, we're not going to succeed in the battle. We have to come together to work together. So I think that the message is very clear. The message of COVID-19 should be very clear. But of course, what we cannot do is overcome the traditional impulses of the great powers who have always found multilateralism to be an inconvenience and an easy thing to bash. So before I answer the question about whether China could have done more, let me address your question about globalization. And I also want to emphasize that second point, that globalization is also a sunrise industry. Yes, it's going to take a big setback from COVID-19, but you'll come back. And the reason why it's a sunrise industry is that today, virtually every human being on the planet is connected to every other corner of the planet through this one small device, the phone. And this smartphone gives information to everybody every day what the state of the world is like. And they know that the world is their oyster in some ways. And people are not going to just stay in their countries. People, when things get back to normal a bit, people will still traveling and going around. And here, the key point I want to emphasize is that globalization was a gift from the West to the rest. Another one of the big gifts that they gave us, they open borders, trade, and so on and so forth. But today, paradoxically, there is certainly in the United States a huge backlash against globalization, walking away from free trade agreements, and so on and so forth. And the reason why I say we will go to a China-centric globalization is that China will not withdraw from globalization, because China actually did withdraw from globalization for 200 to 300 years. And as a result of that, China got trampled by the Western powers in the 19th century. And the Chinese discovered you build great walls, you get beaten up. The way you become strong, you globally engage the world. And the only reason why China has come back so powerfully, so strongly in the last 30 to 40 years after Deng Xiaoping launched modernization is because China has engaged the world. So China knows that the only way for China to become strong is to remain globally engaged. So China is not going to close its doors. China is going to integrate with the rest of the world. And that's why it will be a more China-centric globalization, unless, of course, the United States does a U-turn and says, no, I'm going to compete globally also. So that is the uncertain factor. Maybe I'll deal with South China Sea and North Korea a bit later. But on the question on could China have done more? And I think we should try to find the answer to that question. But the best way to find the answer to the question is to get the best scientists, the best virologists from United States, Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, put them in a room and don't allow any politicians or civil servants in the room. Let the scientists talk to each other. Let the scientists understand each other, understand how these viruses work. And as you know, these viruses are very, very tricky. I mean, they're so easy to understand, manipulate, control. Why are we so struggling so hard to find a vaccine or a cure? We are dealing with a formidable, and this virus, I must emphasize, has proven to be much more tricky than SARS or Ebola, because in the case of SARS, first you got to get sick. You have fever, you have all the symptoms, people can walk away from you. COVID-19, I could be having it now. I could be infecting people, I wouldn't know, no symptoms. So it's a much more difficult virus. And so why aren't the scientists coming together and dealing with each other? So the most sensible thing we can do is get the politicians and public servants out of this debate and let the scientists talk to themselves. And I think at the end of the day, we will get much better answers when the scientists talk to each other.
That's the related question just coming in, Kishore. What does China have to lose from accepting an inquiry along the lines that you have just said?
Well, I think the main problem is that the calls for the inquiry have become politicized. They have become part of the political blame game against China. And it's the politicization of this issue is part of the problem. And of course, as you know, that's not the only thing that's been pointed at China. Lots of rather, I would say, flagrant accusations have been made against China. And so I think it's quite natural for the Chinese to get very angry in these things. And you know, for anyone who's been in diplomacy, and I was a diplomat for 33 years, if you want to get a great power to cooperate with you, the first rule is don't insult a great power. And then for the and I assure you that if the United States had been in the same position, and if the virus had come from the United States, and you insult the United States, and then you tell the United States to go to a multilateral forum to be examined. Now, I can tell you one thing I learned after 10.5 years as ambassador to the UN, that the country that hates multilateralism the most in the world is the United States of America, for good reason, because they're the #1 power and they find it a constraint. So the United States would never accept for even 1 second any kind of multilateral discussion of what they're doing.
Okay, there's a couple of more questions on multilateralism, because Kiki brought it up too, and one specifically on ASEAN from an EU official dealing with ASEAN. Do you think the COVID-19 will strengthen or weaken ASEAN as a body?
You know, I'm going to give you a very strange answer. And I'm going to tell you that it is possible that COVID-19 will weaken ASEAN, because quite naturally each ASEAN country, and ASEAN countries still relatively speaking, with the exception of Singapore, Brunei, maybe Malaysia, are still relatively speaking developing countries and are struggling. And so they will be focusing on their domestic efforts. So there might be some weakening of ASEAN. But this is, you know, as you know, I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle. And I said that the great strength of ASEAN lies in its weakness. So unlike the European Union, right, which does everything properly, legally, rigidly, and that if you want to join something, you must sign to every dot, every letter, and then say, I agree. That's how the European Union works. And so if the UK doesn't agree, you have Brexit. ASEAN has this formula called 10 minus X. Okay, all 10 of us cannot agree. Maybe 6 of us agree. Why don't 6 of us do it first? You other 4, you come along later. So ASEAN has got a remarkable flexibility. And no ASEAN document is this thick in terms of reaching agreements. They're all a few pages long. And everything is done in a loose, informal style. But that loose, informal style, which looks very weak, is actually ASEAN's strength. So it is. So if you want me to make a confident prediction, I can assure you that there'll be no Brexit within ASEAN.
And Kiki, it's a question here about Japan's role in ASEAN. Does Japan see this as an opportunity to increase its influence in Southeast Asia?
I don't think Japan sees it as an opportunity to have more control on ASEAN. Rather, Japan has already opted to work with ASEAN, and there has been teleconferencing of ASEAN-centered architectures, which discussed and trying to launch efforts together. And I was very much impressed with ASEAN's first move to set up a site to share information on COVID-19. And when we are fighting our battle, it is very important for us to have a site to share information, not only the spread, but also our information on best practices, as well as information on development of vaccine and treatment. So in that sense, I highly value the efforts already, or initiative already taken by ASEAN. And Japan has treasured our relations with ASEAN and is making it very important for us to work with ASEAN on whatever matter in the past, and again on the COVID-19. So I don't think Japan would like to seize the opportunity to control, but rather try to seize the opportunity to work together more closely with ASEAN as well. And that's the way I would like to see things happen.
Okay, and there's a question here about, again, multilateralism and trade, the danger to supply chains. Maybe Kishore first, do you see a radical change in the world trading system because of this discussion about reducing dependency on, for example, putting all your eggs in the China basket?
Yes, I think we will definitely see a reduction of investments in China. I mean, partly because, as you know, Japan, the Japanese government, Kiki can correct me if I'm wrong, has announced a special program to help Japanese industries locate outside China. And then the United States certainly, there's a very, as you know, as part of the very strong anti-China sentiment in the United States, there's also pressure on American companies to rely less on production with China. So you'll see some of that happening. But I want to qualify it with two important points. One is that, let's say if the Japanese shift out of China, they still probably have to go to some other developing country. Let's say they come to the ASEAN countries. So as you know, ASEAN would welcome much more Japanese investment, definitely. And if more Japanese investment comes to ASEAN and ASEAN grows faster, one of the consequences is that as the ASEAN countries grow more prosperous, they will trade more with China. So it's not a zero-sum game. That at the end of the day, everybody will benefit, even with the reallocation of the investment. And the second point I want to make is that, which is a very important point, that at the end of the day, Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage still holds true. So if any country today believes that they should manufacture everything they need at home, they will become effectively like North Korea, right? So you have a choice today. In today's world, you basically, to put it very simply, you can either close yourself up and be as self-sufficient as North Korea, or you can open yourself up and become globally interdependent as South Korea, and then become very prosperous and very successful as an economy. So I cannot imagine a world in which we go back to a world of closing ourselves up. And I can assure you there's no such sentiment, certainly in the ASEAN region. As I mentioned, there's no such sentiment in China, and I think there's no such sentiment in South Korea as far as I know. Because South Korea exports enormously to the rest of the world. I think that at the end of the day, I think even Japan is hugely integrated with the rest of the world. So, and you know, all the countries, for example, in this region are still committed to seeing the implementation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which brings the 10 ASEAN countries together with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and China. So if that takes off, that RCEP takes off, the trade and integration in the region will continue. So I hope that since it was the United States, especially, which taught East Asia the value of Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, I sincerely hope the United States will not forget it as it restructures its economy too.
And the debate in Japan, Kiki, is it roughly as what Kishore was saying?
Yes, I also agree with Kishore's point about Ricardo theory. And for Japan, I don't think we will, so far as I have discussed with Japanese businesses, they don't plan to move out from China, but they would like to have multiple sources for their businesses. So instead of just relying on one source, some of them would like to go for 2 or 3 different sources in order to avoid what they call the fragility of globalization. So it is going to be a choice between fragility, efficiency, and how to balance them out is what Japanese businesses, so far as I have spoken to, are saying. And I don't think Japanese government is encouraging Japanese businesses to move out from China. Rather, for emergency measures, some of them are asking for assistance from the Japanese government. In addition, with this COVID-19, I think Sino-Japanese relations are going for the better. As Brookings paper reported, Japan offered medical supplies, including face masks, in January when the COVID-19 erupted in Wuhan. And then there has been a constant video conferencing or telephoning between Japan and China, trying to help each other. So I don't think it would be not moving out from China for Japanese business.
Fraser, can I add one important statistic just very quickly? Going to the point about investment in Southeast Asia, I think one little known statistic is that United States has invested more in the ASEAN region, ASEAN countries, than I think it has invested in China, Japan, Korea combined. Please don't hold me to the figures now, I can't remember them. There are over $300 billion or something invested in the ASEAN region. And I also want to emphasize that there is in Southeast Asia a huge reservoir of goodwill towards the United States. And this reservoir of goodwill was developed even in the era of the Vietnam War because of American investment, American assistance to Southeast Asia, and paradoxically, of course, the country that was the most country that's been the most bombed by the United States is Vietnam, but the most pro-American country in Southeast Asia is Vietnam. So there is a very strong reservoir of goodwill towards the United States here. So it is a very complicated geopolitical picture that you have to understand. That is not simply black and white in the way that many of the analysts describe what's happening here.
The question, given your experience in the United States, if Biden were to become president, would you expect the United States to have a rapid return to multilateralism?
I would say it will definitely be the case that President Joe Biden will behave more like President Barack Obama and be more respectful of multilateral organizations, multilateral processes. So, for example, President Obama went to Paris for the climate accords. He initiated some nuclear weapons disarmament conferences. So I think and he will probably, I hope, go back to the Iran peace accords that President Obama negotiated. So in that sense, definitely President Biden will be more multilateral than certainly President Donald Trump. But at the same time, it's important to understand that the United States Congress, which is the important body, has consistently put brakes on America's involvement in multilateral institutions. To give you a concrete example, every living Secretary of State in the United States has strongly recommended that the United States should ratify the Law of the Sea Convention, because that at the end of the day is the convention that the United States is using to criticize China for its behavior in the South China Sea. But despite that, the US Congress will not ratify the Law of the Sea Convention, which is a wonderful convention that works in the interest of all of humanity. In fact, the United States, I think, is the only country that hasn't ratified it. So there are structural forces within the US body politic opposing multilateralism that Joe Biden cannot override on his own.
And mentioning the South China Sea, I think Kiki raised this earlier in terms of some powers perhaps trying to take advantage of the situation. She also mentioned North Korean missile testing. Do you want to touch on these 2 points?
Sure. I must say that I'm mystified by what is happening in the South China Sea, but I've also, by the way, learned to become very skeptical of the media reports. And if you read my book, in Has China Won, I begin one chapter by saying that everybody in the Anglo-Saxon media believes that President Xi Jinping gave a commitment to demilitarize the South China Sea, and lo and behold, he militarized the South China Sea after that. But as I say in the book, he made an offer to the United States, and Ambassador Stapleton Roy, a former US ambassador to China, told me, and I quote him in the book, as saying when President Xi made the offer, United States rejected it. It sent naval vessels in. So, it's a very complicated story. So be careful of the media reports you get. So just to tell you my views of South China Sea. Number one, at the end of the day, there'll be no war in the South China Sea. And number two, Singapore is not a claimant. We have no stakes in this issue. The dispute is between China and, on the other side, Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia. I would say within, I don't know when, 5 to 10 years, some kind of deals will be made and we will get negotiated solutions. So I will not worry about a war in the South China Sea. Now, North Korea is a much tougher issue to deal with. And here I must say that I really admire President Donald Trump for having the courage to talk to North Korea. Many of his predecessors, including Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, I think thought about it and said, no, we'll be shocked if we talk to North Korea, which is a dictatorial regime, and so on and so forth. So only he, just like only Nixon could go to China, only Donald Trump could step into North Korea and get away with it. I think he started a very positive process. The tragedy here is that after he made the breakthrough, when the negotiations began and so on, and the details officials were looking at it, and I'll stick my neck out and say this, United States officials made some very unreasonable demands on North Korea. They expect total capitulation from North Korea before giving North Korea anything. And what the North Koreans proposed, from what I understand, is something quite sensible, step by step. I give you this, you give me this, I give you this, I give you this, which is the normal things that what you do in negotiations. But I've just been reading a book by John Mearsheimer called The Great Delusion, and he describes how the United States negotiates. And he says the United States attitudes towards negotiations, especially with illiberal regimes, is that I am liberal, you're illiberal. I am virtuous, you're evil. You give me everything, I give you nothing. This is what John Mearsheimer says in his book. So I think that if you adopt that kind of approach with North Korea, you're not going to get a solution. So at the end of the day, if you do want to deal with North Korea, it is feasible, because and this is of course sometimes comes shocking to many people. North Korea is just a careful, rational actor. It is trying to maximize, obviously, its position, which is what all rational actors do. But you can make deals with North Korea, and that's something that Trump actually opened the door for us to do so. It's so unfortunate that the officials didn't follow through the Trump's initiative in opening the door to North Korea.
Kiki, do you want to come back on that?
No.
You're happy with that? Now, there's a question here about what can Asia do concretely to support multilateralism. I mean, the EU is in the same position, strongly committed, and has set up this interim body to deal with dispute settlement mechanism after the Americans walked away. What more can the EU and Asia do together to try and support multilateralism in the absence of any American commitment?
Fraser, I think I haven't been provocative enough in my replies to you. So maybe if you don't mind, I'll throw in a provocation, because sadly, as one thing I learned as an ambassador to the UN for 10 years. So, I've really worked in the insides, deep in the basements, trenches of the UN. So I know what really goes on in as they say, in the salt mines. And here, the tragedy here is that, of course, we know in the United States, to be fair, has been very honest about it, very open about it, and said, no, we don't want to see a strong UN. We want to cut funding to the UN. We want, they basically, or the other day, for example, the World Health Organization, in 1971, 62% of the funding of the World Health Organization came from mandatory funding, which is what you can use for long-term planning. Today, that number has gone down from 62% to 18%. And why has it gone down from 62% to 18%? Because number one, the United States said we must cut it. Number two, the European Union countries went along with the United States. And I saw it in my own eyes, and I was shocked. I said, surely the European Union should understand that you live in either, you can call it a global village or on the same boat. And if the West makes up 12% of the world's population, it's in the logical, rational self-interest of the 12% to strengthen multilateral institutions, which mean the 88% and 12% can work together under the multilateral fabric. So the European Union countries have been shooting themselves in the foot by supporting American efforts to reduce funding to multilateral institutions. So I believe it's in the interest of the European Union to make a U-turn and now raise the level of mandatory funding of the World Health Organization from 18% back to 62%. EU should take the lead, and I'm confident if the EU takes the lead, Asia will support it.
Well, yesterday, von der Leyen gave the lead in terms of the pledging conference for a vaccine for COVID-19. And of course, the whole talk constantly in Brussels is the importance of multilateralism and trying to do something. But looking forward to where you have in the going forward with the summits, we have ASEM coming up, and there's a question here about specifically on the Asia-Europe meeting. Is this potentially a forum where the two sides, Europe and Asia, could work together? And if so, on what specific topics?
Maybe I'll take the first attempt, and I hope Kiki will come in and give her views too. Because I have a very peculiar relationship with the Asia-Europe meeting process, ASEM process, because as you know, it was proposed by Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong in the mid-1990s, and I was the permanent secretary of the foreign ministry at that time, and I was the chief salesman of ASEM. So I flew to London, Paris, I think then still Bonn, I'm not sure, and then Madrid, Dublin, Brussels marketing ASEM, and I was so happy when the first ASEM summit meeting was held in Bangkok. We were thrilled. We thought it's taking off. But of course, after the first summit meeting, it was followed immediately by the Asian financial crisis and the tragedy that during the Asian financial crisis, the Europeans saw the Asian states crumble again, and they say, oh, there goes Asia, forget Asia, we're not interested. So the interest in ASEM then went down after the Asian financial crisis. And I think it was a strategic mistake on the part of the European members of ASEM to reduce the significance of ASEM, and of course, many EU head of government didn't turn up and so on and so forth. So I think now, as a result of COVID-19, if you are looking for one vehicle that can actually work together to, in a sense, be the launching pad for stronger global cooperation against COVID-19 in the post-COVID-19 world, I would say let us use ASEM as the platform because it brings together the key players. It is one of the most underutilized platforms in the world, but the post-COVID-19 world gives the ASEM a chance to have a renaissance and re-establish its credibility and its usefulness to the world.
Many EU officials loving everything you said there about ASEM, and they're still trying to work out whether they will have a physical meeting in Phnom Penh in November or whether it will be a virtual meeting. I think the final decision will be in July, but I certainly share your views on ASEM. Kiki, do you want to add anything on ASEM?
I entirely agree with the observations made. ASEM should renew its commitment to multilateralism and should play its role in facing aftermath, or hopefully consequences of COVID-19. At the same time, I have a question. I agree with the need to promote multilateralism, and that's something I have researched on for many years. But there are complaints, dissatisfactions with multilateralism, and I think we need to reshape multilateralism so that more people would join the group. And in that sense, some UN institutions have weakness because of the will of member states. And as you have taken up the example of WHO, in addition to strengthening the funding for the institution, which is quite short of the needs, are there anything else that we can enhance or strengthen WHO? Because I thought it was created in 1948 or something. And when I look at rules, it seems it is not a very strong organization to fight against the pandemic. So are there any way that we can strengthen WHO, for example?
Well, I would say, can I respond, Fraser? There is one very simple way to strengthen multilateralism. There is a magic key that's available, and that magic key is what I spoke about in my book, The Great Convergence. And I begin by quoting from a speech that President Bill Clinton gave in Yale in 2003. And President Bill Clinton said that if the United States is going to be #1 forever, then fine. We can do whatever we're doing. We're #1. Nobody's going to shake us. Then he added a but. His but was that, but if we can conceive of a world when we are no longer #1, then surely it is in America's national interest to strengthen multilateral rules, multilateral processes, multilateral norms, multilateral institutions, because that's the world that a #2 feels comfortable living in. So the whole point of my book, The Great Convergence, was to persuade the United States that the United States was undermining its own national interests by undermining multilateralism. That is actually in America's national interest to strengthen multilateral institutions, because, to put it very bluntly, even though Bill Clinton didn't say it, it'll be from an American point of view the easiest way to put constraints on China when it becomes number one. So I was appealing to America's national interest, and this is where I fear that the allies of the United States, and I would say especially the European Union and Japan, you have not been kind to your good friend United States, because you have not told the United States as clearly as I have that it is in America's national interests to strengthen these multilateral institutions. I can tell you that when I serve at something called the Commission of Eminent Persons to review the future of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, I saw the same problem. Again, the United States was trying to cut down the funding for IAEA when the whole world wants to see greater institutions against nuclear proliferation. It didn't make sense to me at all. So at the end of the day, there's no point appealing to ideals, to altruism. None of it will ever strengthen multilateralism. You have to appeal to the rational self-interest of the great powers. And here, right now, we have an amazing opportunity, because if the United States flips and begins to support multilateral institutions, China, the rising number one power, today still supports multilateral institutions. So we have a window of opportunity today, if we can persuade both the US and China to strengthen the multilateral institutions, because it will benefit 7.5 billion people. But this brief window of geopolitical opportunity that we have to strengthen multilateralism won't last forever. So that's why the friends of the United States, including those in Europe and Japan, should tell the United States, please reconsider the wisdom of what you are doing in terms of undermining multilateralism, because it is against America's national interest to do so.
I think that's a very fine way to sum up where Europe and Asia can come together. Whether we'll succeed or not in changing views in America must be open to doubt, but I agree we should certainly be trying. So we've come to the end of our time. Thank you both very much indeed. It's been a really excellent debate. And for our viewers, thank you for looking in and posing your questions. Next week, we're looking at the greening of China with Isabel Hilton, editor of China Dialogue. And then after that, we have two further webinars, one on the Korean Peninsula and another on connectivity between Europe and Asia. So thank you, Kishore, thank you, Kiki, and thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore.
Thank you, Kiki. Thank you, Fraser.
Thank you, Fraser.